Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest for the third time is Dave Decamp. He's, of course, at antiwar.com, which I can't recommend enough, and all that crowd, Kyle Anzalone, Scott Horton, and all the good people doing work there. He's here today to talk about Israel, which is obviously in the headlines everywhere, leaving Ukraine, China behind, and, even the fact that Biden's met with Xi Jinping and it's barely kind of been even talked about too much. But he's here to talk about Israel, and it's great to have you again on the show, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
So first of all, as I was kind of mentioning before we started, the first time I had you on, a year or a good few months ago, you mentioned that Israel was one of the topics that kind of got you into where you are today and kind of built up to looking into foreign policy. So can you just kind of tell people about that kind of journey and the specific things that kind of enlighten you to Israel? Because it's obviously it's one of the most controversial, polarizing subjects around, if not the most in the foreign policy kind of side and geopolitical. And there's a lot to it, and people see different sides of it, as in the negativity and, Israel's actions. So what was it about Israel that you kind of saw that got you onto this journey?
Yeah, well, I was just so kind of shocked about how little I knew about the whole situation, growing up and even going through college. Yeah, I didn't go to a typical college, but I just didn't learn anything about the situation. I was kind of just taught about there's this Jewish state in the Middle East and all the Arab countries want to destroy it. And I always assumed it was always there. I actually really had no idea. I mean, that's how ignorant of the situation I was. I always thought there was a state of Israel, and it was kind of coming to that realization that the modern state of Israel, just came into existence in 1948. And it was placed, it was created in a place where people lived, where Arabs lived, and they were driven out of their homes and pushed out to make way for this new state. And, I was really learning about the occupation in the West Bank as well. That opened my eyes up to it, because there's really no way to look at that and say that it's justified from what the Israelis are doing there. This isn't some old situation like in the U.S. or other Western countries where they took over the land from the natives, hundreds of years ago. This is something that has that's still happening right now in the West Bank, especially now. Things have really ramped up there in the past year since this new Netanyahu government came in. It's made up of settlers. There's very extremist settlers in the coalition who explicitly want to annex the West Bank and push all the Palestinians out. And this is even ramped up even more since October 7th. I mean, almost 200 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since then. If that was going on without this war in Gaza, that would be huge news. Everybody would be talking about all this violence in the West Bank. But of course, being overshadowed by, the much higher level of violence in Gaza. So he was really learning about that and kind of seeing how the conversation was about Israel, how you couldn't question Israel's influence on our politics. How you couldn't, you have to support Israel or, you're an anti-Semite. And it was kind of peeling all that back because, it's different in the US now, and it's also different in the rest of the world, especially in Europe. I mean, the conversation is much different. People are much more open to criticizing Israel. It's kind of strange how it is in the US, but that has changed now with social media, and it seems like Israel's really losing the PR war. But not that long ago, the idea of there being members of Congress that were so strongly opposed to supporting Israel, that's a pretty new thing. It's only a handful of them, but that's pretty significant. So he was learning about that. That really kind of opened up my eyes, kind of having that moment of like, oh, everything is not, what it seems when it comes to the U.S. Empire and its allies.
You specifically mentioned it again. This might just be at the time you mentioned it, but you mentioned about Israel having nukes and the fact, obviously, Israel constantly goes on about Iran, and if you want to take it back to WMDs and Iraq, and obviously Israel was quite influential in that war. You had Benjamin Netanyahu obviously testifying in Congress just after he left power. So they constantly, speak about different countries in the Middle East having nuclear weapons when, it's understood pretty much everywhere that they do have them, Israel, but they have never admitted it. So was that also one of the things that kind of brought you to this situation?
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like the narrative is just so that we see in the media is just so wrong. They talk about, oh, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, there's going to be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and just usually, most media coverage of Iran's nuclear program, and not just Iran's nuclear program, but with relation to Israel. I mean, Israel is the one constantly kind of hyping up this phony threat of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which it doesn't have. But the whole time, Israel actually has a secret one that's not subject to any kind of inspections like Iran's is, like Iran's civilian nuclear program is, and you know, it's just another one of those things. You say, wait a minute, Israel has nuclear weapons that they don't tell anybody about, that is not officially acknowledged even by the U.S. It's another example of kind of this U.S. hypocrisy toward the region, toward Israel and in the other countries in the region. And it's there's this deal, this secret deal that the U.S. and Israel make every few years or so that, look, you don't officially acknowledge your nuclear weapons program. We won't try to push you to sign the non-proliferation treaty. Let's just pretend it doesn't exist. We'll keep giving you military aid, and that's that. And Israel is constantly attacking Iran's nuclear program. They've killed nuclear scientists. They've blown up they've planted bombs in nuclear facilities. I mean, if any other country was doing that, it would be a huge scandal. It would be something that we hear about all the time, but it just goes on kind of very quietly, this covert war between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, I mean, you'd hear something like recently that India may have had a hand in the killing of the person in Canada.
Mhm.
Not there's been a massive news story, but that's also because India, the US wanted to court them. Maybe I'm not sure what's going on
Yeah,
there.
they
Yeah,
did.
Israel obviously assassinating scientists in Iran, uh, even though they have their own ones, and I'll put it up on the screen. But even Britain, they have like a parliamentary thing, and it even says, Israel has never admitted it, but it's widely believe that they have nukes, and then it even gives you a number of how many they think they have. And it's pretty insane. Whatever you think about Iran, even if you believe Iran did have a nuclear weapon or was trying to, or Iraq at the time, the fact that Israel is the one constantly pushing this line, but they have it in secret and have no
Mhm.
checks themselves is just, yeah, an obvious example of hypocrisy. Just going back to what you said there, so you said it's changed over the last, maybe decade or so because of social media. But, with the situation going on now, in the general public, even on the internet, or, when you go out and see, how strong is still the support for Israel, not in government, but in the general population? Because, I mean, in the UK, it's obviously not as strong as the US, because the US have the most kind of special relationship with Israel, but it's still fairly strong in a lot of segments of the UK. I don't know if it'd be a generational thing where maybe more people my age, around the age of 22 and around, probably aren't as interested in it, so don't have much of an opinion. Yeah, where do you kind of see the public opinion in the US? Is it still heavily, towards Israel, rather than not rather than Palestine, but just still very strong towards Israel, quite a blind eye to it?
Yeah, I think it's still generally strong toward Israel, but it's definitely changing. If you look at the polls about Israel, it shows that people in their 20s and 30s are, not, don't see what the big deal is about Israel, don't see why we need to have this special relationship with them. And I think more people are kind of realizing how strange it is, especially now in this new era of social media. You could go on Instagram and see a journalist in Gaza. It's not, there's not as much content now that there's been more internet outages and stuff. But there's this one guy, it goes from airstrike site to airstrike site, and you see people pulling children, sometimes dead, out of the rubble. And like people see that and say, like, why are we supporting this? And then if you get curious and start kind of digging into the issue, then you see the history of it. Um, so yeah, I think things are changing pretty significantly, but at the same time, You have a Democratic president right now who's all in, very, very pro-Israel, is Biden. But it seems like there is a civil war going on. Even within the government, there's a lot of dissent. Um, and within the Democratic Party, I think it's going to really, things are really changing. It's not just kind of these progressives like Ilhan Omar, AOC, that you're going to see speaking out against this. I think you're going to start to see more moderates even come out and kind of change their opinions more just because of all the pressure. I mean, if you look at the protests here, there's a lot of different factions and stuff, but one of the biggest factions organizing them is, Jewish Voice for Peace, which, they are progressives, but they're not, radical communists or anything. These are left-wing Jews in America who don't want the U.S. to be supporting this mass slaughter in Gaza or the occupation in the West Bank. And I think that's a pretty powerful political force. So, yeah, I think Israel's days are kind of numbered, being the way that the influence that they have had over U.S. politics. But still, in the long run, I mean, you look at the Republican Party, there's basically nobody who comes out against this stuff. You have Thomas Massie, who's a congressman from Kentucky. He votes against all the aid for Israel, saying that, we're bankrupt, we can't afford it. And he's also kind of principled in his anti-war stances. So it's about that. And they really are attacking him. And, that's another thing. The way that they're going, the Israel lobby's going after him, I think might open some people's eyes. And I know just from my, these are personal anecdotes, but I have a lot of friends who are, on the right, considered right wing, who voted for Trump, who are not on board with this war right now. And it might just be because they're friends with me, but it does seem like even there are some people on the right, even some prominent figures who are not going along with this, who did oppose the war in Ukraine and are also opposing U.S. involvement here. At the same time, unfortunately, you see, it felt like we were really making some progress with the right in this country, even in Congress, the MAGA Republicans who were really staunchly against funding the war in Ukraine. But now we're seeing them all, pretty much all of them, vote for aid to Israel to support this war that risks getting the U.S. sucked into a pretty major regional conflict. That's something we could talk about too, is the risk of this thing really exploding.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my later questions, but just since you mentioned it there about kind of an internal civil war, and obviously Joe Biden being, throughout his whole kind of political life being pro-Zionist and pro-Israel, wasn't there a recent article? I can't remember if it was you or Carl Anzalone just posted something recently on Twitter about, was it 1,000 USAID workers writing a letter to the White House about their support to Israel, and 2 other employees around the government. And obviously had that one person, Jake something, who resigned. Is that kind of what you're referring to with the kind of internal civil war?
Yeah. So far there's been 3 dissent memos sent to Antony Blinken in the State Department. And that's it. They made this like dissent channel during the Vietnam War where American diplomats could kind of express their opposition to certain policies. So there's been a lot of them. There's also been a letter signed by 1,000 U.S. aid employees, which that's a lot. And most recently, there was this open letter sent to President Biden. This was reported by the New York Times, of more than 400 U.S. officials from 40 government agencies, including the FBI, the DOJ, the National Security Council. And what was interesting, it actually said that most of the signatories were political appointees, because it seemed like the State Department dissent was coming from kind of career diplomats, which are considered, at a lower level. But a lot of them, the guy that resigned, I'm blanking on his name, but he worked in the State Department for a long time. And it's those type of people who were really speaking out against it. So it's interesting that this letter was political appointees, because they're the ones that, generally don't want to rock the boat too much, because they're there thanks to Biden or, and his people. So it's interesting to see that. So I think it shows that this is pretty significant, this opposition. So at the same time, it's good to see the opposition, but it could hurt Biden, in the next election. A Republican comes in and is just going to go all in for Israel, which Biden, I mean, it's tough to be any more pro-Israel than Biden is, but, the Republican might just do the same thing. and maybe not, work to get any aid into Gaza at all. Um, but again, it still is hard to imagine somebody being more supportive of what Israel's doing.
Yeah, so what do you make of kind of the Israeli reaction so far, and the fact even the US, there's been multiple kind of reports of the US kind of trying to get Israel to kind of restrain a bit and, do these humanitarian corridors, just to even maybe it's PR, which is probably mostly what it is. And I mean, Israel kind of seems in a similar situation. They're completely kind of different, but similar in where the attack that happened that Hamas did, killing civilians, is obviously not justifiable. And even if you think they're kind of Israeli settlers and they deserved it, they are civilians at the end of the day, and they were born and raised in that country. And like many other countries, you believe your environment, what you've been told by authority. It was obviously a horrible attack, and similar to kind of the US, where they was attacked on 9/11. Obviously, it was a horrible attack by these kind of groups, and people are demanding a reaction. And there's a point where they just go too far. So now we can look at 9/11 and say the reaction to it of 3,000 citizens getting killed. And then you have the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, which, those groups obviously didn't have loads to do with it. But people can look back and be like, at the time, I was kind of all in for, self-defense, but it went way beyond that. The proportion was nowhere near. Where I know these are different scenarios, but Israel has been attacked for different reasons, obviously. And there's lots of people in the UK, the US, who say Israel should defend itself, go after Hamas, like people would say, go after Al Qaeda. But then instead of going after Al Qaeda, they go after this. And instead of maybe going after Hamas, which they might be, and they probably are, there's so many civilians, Palestinians, Gazans getting caught up in it that it's no longer proportionate. So I know that was a long-winded question, but it was kind of just a small comparison. What do you make of Israel's reaction to the attack? How much further are they going to take this? And for all their rhetoric of saying they're going after Hamas, which they well may be, in sections and have special operations, and they're still trying to bomb them. Has it gone way beyond Hamas, and this could be more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the response and the people that are being killed, we don't really have a clear death toll anymore. The latest numbers from the Gaza's health ministry was over 11,000, including over 4,500 children. At one point, Biden and the White House said, "Oh, we can't believe those numbers," but since then, another U.S. government official said that they think the number is actually higher. There's thousands of people under the rubble. And now the communications have really broken down that they're not getting all the reports of dead people. So when think about Hamas in Gaza, they have this vast tunnel network. And Israel has just been bombing, residential buildings, just bombing all sorts of buildings and schools and UN shelters, and just bombing everything in sight pretty much. So if you're in Hamas, I mean, you got to figure most of them are down in the tunnels, except for the ones that go up to fire rockets. And now the ones that are actually fighting the Israelis on the ground in North Gaza, so really there's no way to know how many Hamas people were killed by those airstrikes, in that 11,000 number, over 4,500 children is huge. And I remember when the death toll was around 7,000, they actually published the names and ages of all the people that were killed because Biden was accusing them of lying. And you look at the children, some people might think, oh, they're not children, they're teenagers fighting for Hamas. But actually, most of them, from what I saw, were like in the 10 to 12 range. These are really young kids that are being killed, and babies and infants and toddlers. Like, it's just horrific. So what I think Israel is trying to do, I think it's pretty clear at this point, is that they're trying to get all the Palestinians to leave Gaza, and they're going to kill the ones that don't leave. Right now, they're focused on the north. They gave that evacuation order to get out. They continue to bomb the south, but the north has been the brunt of the bombing, and that's where the ground troops are. So I think they want to take over the north, push all of the Palestinians out, basically conquer the northern Gaza Strip, and then hope that at that point, there was just something I covered yesterday. 2 Israeli members of the Knesset, one in the Netanyahu's Likud party, and the other in, I think it's Yesh Atid, it's the main opposition party, led by Lapid, who was the previous prime minister. they wrote this op-ed saying, "Oh, the West should take Palestinian refugees." The original plan, based on a leaked Israeli intelligence document, was that they wanted to push them all out, all 2.3 million of them, into Egypt, set up a barrier zone in Egyptian territory. And of course, Egypt's never going to go for that unless maybe they get bribed enough by the U.S. But right now, you have the U.S. saying, no, 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 you can't. The Palestinians, it's their home. They can't be kicked out of it. But that doesn't really matter what they're saying because they're giving Israel unconditional support to do what they're doing. But I think that's the clear goal now, and it's Israeli officials within the government, within the parliament, from all different, ends of the political spectrum in Israel saying that they want to kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza. It's not a secret. So I think it's clearly what they're trying to do. And I think Netanyahu also knows he's on a, he doesn't have all the time in the world to do this. At some point, politically, it's not going to be, the U.S. isn't going to be able to give him this unconditional support, possibly. So right now he's thinking like as much destruction, kill as many of these people, push out as many of these people as we can right now. At least let's get the northern Gaza Strip, and then we'll take it from there.
Just quickly on the numbers, as you do kind of hear people say this, how seriously should we take? I know you mentioned the US officials say it could be more. But how seriously should we say numbers coming out of technically, the opposite army, militia, whatever you want to call them? They are, the opposition. So, on all sides of war, you might inflate the amount of number of people killed because it makes your enemy look worse. So, in the past and now, how seriously should we take the Hamas Ministry of Health's numbers, as obviously they are, the ones fighting Israel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely something to keep in mind. Past conflicts have shown that their numbers are reliable. The 2014 Gaza war, I forget the exact number, but let's just say the Gaza's health ministry reported 2,400 were killed. The UN confirmed like 2,300 something, and then Israel actually did their own count, and their number was like 2,200 something. So based on that, and I think just the sheer destruction that we're seeing in Gaza, I mean, you could look at the satellite images of just whole neighborhoods being wiped out. It's not an unreasonable. These numbers aren't unreasonable at all. And I think it is safe to say that it's probably higher at this point, since, in the past few days, they haven't really updated the numbers much. So, and again, the rubble, and if they are killing, they are dropping some bunker busting bombs that are probably collapsing tunnels. And there's probably Hamas guys down there that are getting killed as well that aren't getting counted. So, yeah, and there's also, I know The Intercept did a report. They talked to a Palestinian who lives in Florida who had family in Gaza, and 46 members of his family were killed, and they found them on the list that they published. They found 43 of them on the list that they published. So, it's real names that they put out. So I think, again, at this point, there was also a report in Israeli media that said that real death toll is probably 20,000. I haven't seen that really confirmed anywhere else, but yeah, I think it's at this point in the war, I wouldn't have said this a few weeks ago, but that the 11,000 number is probably a conservative estimate.
Yeah, and this is kind of one of the main reasons to oppose this war. Even if you are pro-Israeli, and I know people find it quite hard to get past what happened on the 7th of October and what Hamas did, killing obviously all those civilians. And, if we're being honest, Hamas has made it very hard for the Palestinians in the world, as in PR-wise. They've given them a very bad name. Whether you think the strategy behind what Hamas did was right or wrong, they've given the Palestinians a bad name. People, I'm still here, my camera's just gone. They obviously give the Palestinians a bad name because people can only see Hamas now. When you bring up Palestine or all these protests that are going on in the UK and around, people just see it being as pro-Hamas. And then, just a big generalization. So wherever you think about it, they have, messed things up for the Palestinians, but they would have thought, well, no one cared about them anyway. But obviously, again, people should take into account Gaza, a population of just over 2 million in a very small, what David Cameron, the now Foreign Secretary of the UK, called when he was Prime Minister in 2009, an open-air prison. Over 1 million of that population are children. So even if you want to say the line, well, Gaza elected Hamas, and well, that's their, it's their problem, just like people said about Iraq. Well, Saddam Hussein's your leader, so you have some responsibility. So a million of them are children, so clearly have no responsibility, and a lot of them would have been children when they elected them. So you can't just be like, a million Gazan Palestinian children, this is your fault. No one would accept the world bombing the UK, and you say, well, that's because what Tony Blair did. And we'd say, well, we didn't have any control over what Tony Blair did. That people elected him, or I didn't elect him. We didn't have a choice in those wars. They did unaccountable things. We can control that. So I don't see why it should be any different. Just the sheer amount of children should kind of be enough to change your mind about it. But just on Hamas again, and a repeated thing you hear, and I personally have not looked into this too much, so I would never debate it massively. But you hear constantly that Hamas, the reason for these civilians who are getting killed, and Israel keeps saying that they're only going for Hamas. They're the most safest army. They don't try and kill civilians or anything like that. Is because Hamas is hiding in civilian populations. There was that article the other day that there was like a tunnel going under this child's bed. Hamas are embedding themselves in hospitals, all these places. What do you make of that? Is there an element of truth to it, but it's exaggerated? Or because the tunnels are technically under civilian locations, that's kind of how they spin it. What do you make of the term, the phrasing that constantly you hear, that Hamas embeds itself in the civilian population, therefore it's collateral damage and it's all fine?
Yeah, so one thing I want to mention about Hamas before I get into that, that this is something Scott Horton's been really focused on, is kind of Israel's, specifically Netanyahu and his faction, their support for Hamas. And it's not some conspiracy theory that Israel created Hamas. It's just the fact that the Israeli politicians who are against the establishment of a Palestinian state basically view Hamas, the split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They use that to what they thought, I guess, was their advantage, because they never thought Hamas could carry out an attack like it did on October 7th. And Bezalel Smotrich, who is a minister, one of these extremist ministers in Netanyahu's government, he's the finance minister, he said in 2015, Hamas is an asset and the PA is a liability. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They'll never get any kind of international recognition. So that's the thinking for a lot of people within the Israeli government, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people in Israel are blaming this attack on Netanyahu. They're putting a lot of the fault at him, especially for how could you miss the intelligence that this attack was coming? That's a whole nother thing. So yeah, it's just interesting that you said that Hamas has given the Palestinians this really bad reputation. And the Israelis have, used that, leveraged that. So to get into the whole human shields thing, it's tough to really say. I know that there is some element of truth to them firing rockets from populated areas. Part of the reason is because Gaza is so densely populated. But how true is it that they set up and embed themselves within civilian populations to kind of draw this fire? To use them as human shields, I'm not really sure. And then right now, Israel's raiding a hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital, the largest hospital in Gaza in the north. And they're saying there's a Hamas complex underground, that there's, and there is, again, Hamas has this vast tunnel network. So it's possible that they have something under the hospital. I saw Jeremy Scahill say something very interesting today on Twitter. He's a journalist from The Intercept. He said that Israel actually built some big basement under the Al-Shifa hospital in 1983, when Israel still was in Gaza. And they're saying that they connected their tunnels to that basement. So there might be some truth to it, but the fact is we don't know, and we know that the Israelis have a lot of propaganda. They lie a lot about airstrikes they say they didn't do. It turns out they did do them. And they're not showing us any compelling evidence. You see these IDF, these videos. One was in a basement. They're like, oh, this is, look at all these weapons we found. How do you know that they found the weapons there? And And now you have the U.S. backing up their assertion that the Al-Shifa hospital, Hamas, has a command center underneath or something. They're not providing any evidence either. So it's tough to trust them. And you have to think that if this is true, the hospital's full of, there's about 700 patients there, including about 30 premature babies who had to be taken out of their incubators that failed because they lost power. And Israel's sending troops in there. There's got to be a better way to do it than that, So these are all just things to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, I should be having Scott Horton and Connor Freeman on, not together, separate times over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to get them to where you mentioned there about the Israeli government backing Hamas kind of from its founding, and kind of Netanyahu's policy to keep it alive, so that no one will take that Palestinian territory, Gaza, seriously compared to the West Bank, and create a one state, because Hamas is a terrorist organization. No one's going to take it seriously. It's not going to get a seat at the UN, and it's too easily just seen for what it kind of is. They wrote an article, obviously, about that a couple of weeks ago that I've been reading. I can't remember the name of the person, but she used to be the Minister of Information. And she put out this, the thing about Israeli officials, they do really put out some candid tweets and interviews, and you can read it from themselves or listen to them. You don't have to hear me say it. You can literally read them say it on their own Twitter. And she put something crazy out the day, saying that all, Gaza are animals and monsters, and that we should wipe out the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And then she even references like the Nazis, and you're like, if the Nazis said something, the other way around, people would go, crazy. She's basically saying wipe out 2 million people, 1 million of them children. Again, you can't fault children for being children. And then she put something else out in 2019 where she mentions, let's be honest, Benjamin Netanyahu keeps Hamas on its feet. It wants it kind of stable and healthy and not to go away because it has a political purpose and it's an asset, kind of what you've been saying. I'll put that in the show notes, I'll put it up on the screen. But yeah, she said some pretty bizarre things, and she's the Minister of Information. So, she's meant to be the person who's meant to keep a lid on this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And, again, you have officials who come out and say about using the doomsday device and using possibly nukes when Israel doesn't have nukes. So how could they do that? And I think Benjamin Netanyahu had to walk back something the other day from one of the officials. But what do you think of how this could play out in the United Nations, as in the organization itself? Because we know the UN doesn't have loads of power when it comes to wars, and it can say as much as it can. And, throughout, since World War II, obviously, the US has had a lot of influence, and, having 3 NATO countries on the Security Council, and, Russia, China can use their own influence too when they can by vetoes. Do you think the UN could get sick of what's happening here? Because, they've reported they've had over 100 UN people killed, which is, in their words, unprecedented. It's never happened before. They've never had this amount die. So, again, they don't have loads of power. Do you think there's a point where the UN could become more, just come out more against Israel, like a lot harsher, and maybe come out and say something like it's an apartheid state, or actually report what's happening quite strongly? Because, over 100 UN employees to die in a month is pretty insane, unless you're saying that they're Hamas or whatever you want to say. So where do you think the UN could go with this?
Yeah, well, I think already they've been pretty critical of what Israel's doing. I know the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I know one UN official, I forget what his position was, but it was pretty high up, actually resigned over saying they weren't doing enough to stop Israel's genocide in Gaza. So, when it comes to the UN Security Council that passes resolutions and stuff, still that don't really mean too much. That's one thing that the U.S. always does for Israel at the UN Security Council is veto the anti-Israel resolutions. And it's funny because actually that quote from Smotrich, he was saying that Hamas, one of the things he said is that Hamas won't be able to get any resolutions at the UN that we would need the U.S. to veto. Like, it's just funny how they expect the U.S. to always veto this stuff. I believe there was one, I forget what it was over, but at the final days of the Obama administration, there was a veto against settlements or something. No, there was a UN resolution against settlements, and the U.S. did not veto it. And that was actually kind of at the center of the Russiagate conspiracy, was that General Flynn, who's going to be Trump's national security advisor, called Russia to ask them to veto it. So the narrative was that, oh, he's working for the Russians, but he was actually making the call for Israel. It's actually more like Israel Gate than Russiagate. So it's kind of an interesting tidbit about the whole Russiagate thing. But yeah, I mean, what can the UN really do? I mean, I think we are seeing a lot of, individual UN officials speaking out like really strongly about what Israel's doing. And that's kind of been happening for a while over the past few years. So I don't know what that can really impact, though, because the UN doesn't really have any power. But it's definitely an example of kind of more of the narrative going against Israel.
Yeah, no, you're right there. The UN doesn't, have any power to do anything, and the ICC have never, touched Israel or the US or anyone previously. So it's pretty unlikely that's going to happen. But they must get so sick of this issue. Even probably the US and UK, as much as they back Israel, they must get really sick of this just every few years kicking off and looking pretty bad. People probably don't realize just how isolated we are on the world stage. The UK and the US are pretty much the only countries not calling for a ceasefire, probably some other NATO countries, but even Macron from France has come out. I mean, people say he keeps flip-flopping, but even he's come out and said some stuff like, we're pretty damn isolated compared to other countries, not just like Arab countries. You have South American ambassadors recalling themselves, and when people talk about Israel, and Judaism and Christianity, and people are like, well, that's why the Arabs obviously they're so against it because they're Muslim. Well, you have South America who really Christian and Catholic, who recall their ambassadors, and their populations are probably against it because they see it as an anti-colonial struggle rather than a religious one. But that's obviously another topic. You mentioned earlier, obviously, the risk of regional war. How much do you think that's a possibility? Because so far, it hasn't seemed like it's kicked off too much with other countries. And do you think the US, I mean, there's lots of people in the US who want war with Iran and have for a very long time. But do the military really want a war with Iran? Because Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a huge country with more sophisticated weapons, infrastructure, economy, and legit allies. So do you think this is going to go into a regional war? And the US, obviously, as you mentioned, has said the support for Israel is unconditional, no matter how many people they kill, and that's been explicit. But is there a point where the US privately, as apparently they've been trying to do more private work than public, is to reel them in and say, this is too much for us on the world stage to handle at a time where we're weakening anyway, and as the Arab countries can't turn a blind eye for that much longer? So do you think there's a real chance of regional war, or do you think it's probably not, it's likely it could always happen, but is it really going to end up happening?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's definitely the chance in Iraq and Syria, where the U.S. has bases. They've been coming under constant rocket and drone attack since like mid-October from the Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. And the U.S. has launched some airstrikes against them. There were reports that they killed a few of them this past weekend. No U.S. troops have been killed yet, but about over 50 have been injured. So if American troops start dying, that could be an escalation, because it's clear that these militias aren't going to back down. And so who knows what that could spiral into. And then you have the risk with Lebanon, Israel, and Hezbollah. They've been fighting across, kind of trading fire across the border, the Israel's northern border there, since October 7th. And, over 60 Hezbollah fighters have been killed, and a few civilians, and about 10 people, I think, on the Israeli side. So that's pretty significant. I mean, again, if this was going on, it would be a big deal, if absent this Gaza war. So there's the risk there. Nasrallah has given his speeches basically saying that they're still going to keep firing, but he didn't declare mobilization for war or anything, What was interesting is that there was a recent report from Axios, and that said, quoted U.S. and Israeli officials who said that the U.S. was worried that Israel was actually trying to provoke Hezbollah and trying to provoke a wider war in Lebanon. And you had the defense minister, Israeli defense minister, say that what they're doing in Gaza, they can do in Beirut, so which is a pretty serious threat. So it does seem like, and it's interesting. So from that, based on that report, from the U.S. perspective, it's not Hezbollah who's really escalating things here. It's actually Israel. Um, so there's the risk there. Iran, I don't think they want to get directly involved at this point. The U.S. accuses them of the being behind the attacks in Syria and Iraq, and Iran does support these Shia militias, but there's no evidence that Iran is directing these attacks, and they are known to act independently as well. I'm sure that they are happy about it to an extent, that the U.S. is having this trouble in Syria and Iraq, which basically they're still there to keep Iran's influence lower than it would be if the U.S. left. But one thing that showed me like that the U.S., you have the hawks obviously in both countries, in the U.S. and Israel. But one thing that showed me that they didn't really want to turn this thing into a war with Iran is the fact that they didn't blame the Hamas attack on them. I mean, they did in some ways, but they didn't say that there was any evidence that Iran was involved, like directed it or helped plan it. Because if they wanted to blame it on them, they would have, whether there was evidence or not. So I remember that happened kind of early on, that's what the U.S. and Israeli officials were saying, that there's no evidence of Iranian involvement. So yeah, I think that showed. I think for Israel's part, they want to focus on Gaza, although again they are really hitting Hezbollah in Lebanon as well.
I wonder, I mean, if people have even heard it. I wonder how many people have wondered, since all these attacks in Iraq and Syria on US troops and bases, that they're like, hang on, the US is still in Syria or still in Iraq?
Yeah.
I wonder how many people have actually thought that, because the attacks have increased, as you've said. And I know this is something, lots of people, but I heard Scott Horton say recently, I think I found the article the other day, was Mattis and Petraeus both came out and said, our alliance with Israel and how we're seen as so biased has a price on our soldiers, around the Middle East, of just how biased they are towards Israel. So I guess on the Arab kind of side of this, as in Arab countries, how have you kind of perceived what they've done so far? Because we know obviously the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, and then we had the Saudi-Israeli normalization talks. Is there any signs that the Arab countries have come out, stronger than they normally have against Israel? That this is under threat? That anything like that, has it affected their image? Are they going to be able to go through with Israeli-Saudi normalization after this? Or do you think maybe that could be part of the reason that reels Israel in, is being able to progress in their objectives in the Arab countries publicly?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, of course, the Saudis, the UAE, and they've had the rhetoric, but they haven't really taken any kind of dramatic steps, when it comes to the UAE and Bahrain, the countries that did normalize with Israel. I remember there was kind of Bahrain's parliament said that they were going to recall their ambassador from Israel, but that apparently didn't actually happen. So I think they are worried kind of about their population being mad at them for not cutting, severing ties with Israel. And the Saudis, I mean, there's even Saudi officials have said that the war is not going to affect the normalization talks, which is interesting to see them actually come out and say that, because they used to be kind of so careful about this issue not that long ago, when they talked publicly. So, I can't imagine them doing it anytime soon now. I think it's definitely pushed that back. And it's just so hard to predict what this war is going to turn into, that it's tough to really say what's going to become of all that. But yeah, I mean, part of the, Hamas's motive was definitely of launching this big attack, was definitely trying to get the Arab world to, turn on Israel more so. And we've seen the Saudis and Iran, they had that normalization deal recently, and they've been talking about this. So yeah, I think still, like, the Gulf monarchs, just don't really want to rock the boat too much with Israel. They're just going to kind of put out the statements and things. But we're actually seeing most of the opposition from the Shia axis, from Hezbollah, from the Houthis in Yemen, who are firing rockets and missiles, from Iran. More again with the rhetoric, but then you see actually the Shia factions are the ones taking military action. I don't think we're going to see Saudi Arabia go that far.
Yeah, I completely forgot to ask this kind of earlier on. We was kind of talking before the show, and we don't have to give you a crazy amount of time for this because it's, as I kind of discussed, it's beside the main issues. But this term from the river to the sea has, taken on a whole kind of media discussion in the public as well, and the protest when people say it. So what's kind of your if you've looked into the term? I know you mentioned it on Tim Pool. So what does it mean? Is there any one meaning? Does it mean different things to different people? What should we make of it? Should we make nothing of it? So yeah, we'll just give us some background on the term and what you kind of think about it.
Yeah, so it's frustrating because from the, I know a lot of activists and people, and a lot of them are Jewish, who go to pro-Palestine rallies and chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And you see people say, oh, that's a call for genocide because that means all the Jews are going to have to be pushed out. But from, for the most of the activists that I know, what I think the majority of the people who go out and say that, they're saying that from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there should be equal rights, regardless of whether you're a Palestinian or an Israeli Jew. It's about those Palestinians having freedom under the law, the same freedoms that the Israelis have. And, this is a phrase that kind of started in the 1960s, and people associate it with Hamas because of their original charter was, and they've talked about killing Jews, and that's what kind of the pro-Israel people want to make it all about. And we were talking about this before we were recording. It kind of becomes, it's such like this way to get bogged down kind of in the details is debating this phrase. And it's kind of, that's what's really frustrating to me. It's like I was on Tim Pool trying to talk about what Israel's doing in Gaza, but the conversation just became focused on that phrase. And then of course, for some people that means, well, one thing that they say too is that it means, oh, the elimination of the Jewish state. And to an extent that is true, because to have equal rights for Palestinians under one state, that would mean that it wouldn't be a Jewish state, a Jewish supremacist state, which is what it is. And so that people can't wrap their head around that. They think it is kind of a pipe dream, to be real, like the one state solution where everybody has equal rights. I can't imagine that happening anytime soon. So the argument that we had, Tim Pool was saying it implies violence because how else are they going to achieve that? And, again, we just kind of get bogged down in this argument. But I just think the people that say it's a call for genocide, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. And it's just a way to smear all of the protesters because they're saying that phrase. And it's a political phrase, and a lot of them are vague and can be interpreted in different ways. It's just kind of the nature of it. So, there's probably a better thing they could chant, but it's, it's a popular chant when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is you can oppose it on both sides. Again, like you said, I don't need to get too bogged down in this, but for some people, it may mean that, a very small bunch. And there's people on both sides. You condemn it both ways. So if there's genuine Palestinian people who say, no, they want equal rights and a two states, and they want to get along, but they normally, the problem is people get caught up between Zionism and Judaism and Israel as a state, And if you are born in that place, you may, have a negative view of Jews eventually, but the main contention isn't with Jews. It wouldn't, if it's, the British just kept Palestine for themselves forever, and it was the British there. Would people be saying this is because Britain, came from a Christian country, or they're just like, they want you out? Just like any colonial power, France in Africa, Is it about religion? If it was a Muslim country and or not, it's not about religion for most people. It's just about, I want my house back in the West Bank, or I don't want to live here in Gaza, or whatever it may be. But the problem is people obviously get caught up in between that. But if you do have people calling for that, fair enough, condemn them. Just like you should condemn people in Israel calling for the wiping out of, the Palestinians and all these Arabs. And they always go on, some of the more far right, religiously racist ones there, that they hate the Arabs. But at the end of the day, you moved obviously to a part of the world that's surrounded by Arabs. So it should be condemned on both sides. Just like if you're saying Palestine want to take the whole of Israel and there will be no more Jewish state, then you should condemn the people in Israel who are trying to take all of Palestine, just like we can see in the West Bank. As you mentioned before, since this attack on the 7th of October, there's been people basically using it as a distraction to take more land and more houses in the West Bank. And that has been reported on in the media and the UN. So there's, you can condemn both sides. But again, I don't want to get too bogged down in this term because that's not kind of the most important thing.
Well, it is, one thing that is frustrating is that, you have these people that focus so much on what the protesters are chanting. When you have people in the Israeli government, again, saying, explicitly what they want to do is kill all the people in Gaza. I mean, talking about dropping a nuke is a possibility. That was one minister that said that, comparing what they're doing in Gaza to the U.S., nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki and bombing Dresden, comparing, invoking some of the greatest, mass slaughters in recent history to justify what they're doing. And people, you have the settlers, there's protesters too at pro-Israel rallies saying kill all the Palestinians. And, and these are the ones with the power. The Israeli government is the one that has the power to kill everybody if they want to do it. And that's the one that, from the U.S. perspective, is that's our government is on that side, is spending billions of our taxpayer dollars to support them, so that's what we should be focused on.
Yeah, obviously Israel's the one with the military, with a government, with a state, with an air force, with this high-tech technology supplied from the West, from the US, given aid. Israel's not exactly a poor country, and the US gives it aid as if it's like this country that really needs it. And then you have Palestine and Gaza who have none of that, and that's why in situations like this, people become desperate, and you get radical groups like Hamas. And I don't know how many people in Palestine and Gaza actually support them, but at the end of the day, these are the people actually trying to make your life better. Even if the result of the attack has made their life a lot worse, but with these radical groups, people end up turning to them because they kind of see them as their only hope. And you get people in those groups who are absolutely crazy or psychopaths, because to be in a group like that, you have to be radical, just like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, because you're willing to die. You're willing to risk everything against an army that's much stronger than you. So you get, the most radical people. But you mentioned it there. So obviously one point of contention is, and what people, like you were speaking, you was on Tim Paul's show, and he wanted to focus on issues just in America. I don't want to focus on stuff in other countries. But the problem is, it is related to the US and the West, because the US sends taxpayer money to them. It's, responsible in this conflict. It's a party to it. It backs Israel. So, why do you think the US sees, has always treated Israel so special as this ally? Is it just strategic because they're an outpost in the Middle East, but then you have so many other countries, they already have all the Gulf nations, things like that. And then people argue it's because they're a democracy. Obviously, they're only a democracy if you're an Israeli Jew and not a Palestinian. Why do you think the US backs Israel so much, considering it is one of the most contentious issues in the world that causes it, on the public stage right now, the US looks terrible. Whether you think about Israel, to the rest of the world, they don't see it like you may. So why does the US back Israel so much? And you have people like Lindsey Graham saying too many dead. What number of civilians would be too many dead? And he's like, there is no there is none. So why do they back them so much?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because it's not really clear to me. I know there's the Israel lobby has a lot of influence, a lot of religious organizations. The evangelicals, the sect, I believe they're called Dispen. I forget. There's a specific type of evangelical Christian who is very supportive of Israel, because I've had other types of evangelicals tell me, we're not all like that. But oh man, I'm blanking on the strain of it, but it's really a philosophy that started in 1800, so pretty late in Christianity. Believing that the Jews have to be in Israel to bring, around the end times, and Jesus will come back and all that. They have a pretty big influence, and there's also just the fact that there's a lot of Israeli Americans, and then they say that that narrative that it's kind of an outpost, it's the only ally for the U.S. in the Middle East, is just not true. I mean, we're friends with all the Gulf nations at this point. We have more military assets in those countries than actually in Israel. Iran, there's really no reason for the U.S. to not just be open up relations with Iran, and as you can see with Iran and Saudi Arabia mending ties, there's a way that the U.S. could just have relations with everybody in the nation, in the region. And one of the things that disrupts that is the U.S. support for Israel. So that narrative, I think, is just completely phony. This idea that we have to support them because they're our most important ally in the region, when all they do is bring us, make other countries hate us. It's very clear that it's a detriment to the U.S. to support them so strongly. And if the U.S. wasn't backing Israel so strongly, they wouldn't be able to go as hard as they are going in Gaza right now. They would have to worry much more about the risk of a regional war, because right now the U.S. sent all these aircraft carriers and all sorts of other firepower to the Middle East, basically to threaten other countries and other regional actors not to enter the war. And they're relying on that American support to do what they're doing. So I don't think it's really good for people in Israel either to have that. Then their government would have to think more rationally instead of just go in and just kill as many people as you can while you have the time and the U.S. supporting them. So yeah, I mean, it's just I think it really is a matter of the lobby and the influence that they have over our politics. It's really like no other country. I mean, there's over 30 states in the U.S. that have laws on the books against boycotting Israel. That the state will punish companies that boycott Israel. If you're a contractor and you want to enter a contract with these states, in the contract there's like a pledge that you'll never boycott Israel. It's very strange. You can't imagine that for any other country.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point there where you said before, because obviously people's argument is, well, the US and the West has to back Israel, the one democracy in the Middle East, because if we didn't, it would be wiped out by its neighbors. Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran would encroach it, and the Jews would be no more, and it would be violence, war, or genocide, whatever you want to see it as. But you make the point that the US backing it so strongly means it can have that arrogance where it goes into the West Bank and creates settlements. It bombs the country this much. So I mean, I guess you touched on there, but do you see that if the US didn't back them so much, that Israel would behave completely different, and maybe there would be two states by now, as it wouldn't have that political leverage in the UN? Militarily, the aid itself, just billions and billions from the US, which is a gift, do you think that Israel would behave incredibly different, and maybe it would be beneficial to both the Palestinians and the Israelis for that to happen?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, I'm not familiar enough with the issue with all the negotiations and the two-state stuff, but I do think that that's certainly possible, that they would have had to actually negotiate a two-state solution. And it's not true that the Arab countries would be trying to destroy Israel, because Israel has had agreements and arrangements with Egypt and Jordan for so long. Um, you know, they were really accomplices. Jordan, they made a secret deal with Jordan when Israel was formed in 1948. Basically, we'll take this and push all these Palestinians there. You could have that territory. And then they took the West Bank from Jordan in the 1967 war. But, yeah, I think that it's definitely possible that they would have had to be more open to real negotiations and a real solution if they didn't have this full-throated support from the U.S.
So you give me an hour. So just to finish up, is there anything else you want to say about Israel? Maybe where you see it going, or any points we haven't made that you think is important to get across? I mean, for people listening, I've had Miko Pledon, who was an Israeli born in Israel, who we actually had him on just before this happened. So it was just about Israel and kind of the apartheid side. So if you want to get that, and I had Matthew Ho on, but is there anything you want to get across to people about Israel or this conflict that we haven't discussed that you think is important for them to know?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know, and it sounds like from the guests you've had that your listeners would know just the context of the October 7th attack. You see it called unprovoked, which is what they call the Russian invasion of Ukraine, unprovoked when Gaza's been under a military blockade since 2007, which is just an untenable situation. And they thought that they could ignore it and that Hamas didn't really have the power to do something like this. And it turned out they did. I mean, it was a shocking attack. The fact that Hamas was able to inflict that much damage, nobody expected that. It's not a surprise that they did something like that. The surprise is that they were kind of as successful as they were when it comes to just casualties. And again, that's one of the reasons why people in Israel are not happy with the Netanyahu government. And there's going to probably be a reckoning for him. So that's why, again, he's just going so hard in Gaza. So yeah, I think just the context is important, and it doesn't justify what Hamas did, but people have to understand the causes of these things, or else we'll never be able to end any kind of war, because then you just hear the propaganda narratives.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and that goes for terrorist attacks around the US and Europe during the war on terror, and because they murder civilians, people will not see past that, but that doesn't justify it. But why did they do it? And they normally say, well, the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, or they did a drone bombing in Pakistan and killed my cousins, or whoever, whatever it be. And because the strategy doesn't always work, because they kill civilians, no one cares. Everyone lays on that. How can you do that? That's so inhumane. They never did anything, and then all the other stuff just gets forgotten. Similar to this, they can only see what Hamas did, which was obviously horrible, killing the civilians. But the question is, why did they do that? What led up to it? And why would a group do something like that so controversial that they know the world's going to condemn so much and would go against their cause? Why would they do something like that? But thank you for coming on again, Dave. It was good to see you again. Hopefully, this conflict will be finished by the time we next speak. I'm sure it will be. But thank you for coming on. I'll point everyone to your work at antiwar.com. And obviously you do a rundown of the top articles on antiwar.com on your YouTube channel. I'll put all the links in the description. And just thank you for coming on again. I always appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.